This edition of Mac Voices is brought to you by SaneBox, the best way to take control of your out-of-control email. For a free trial and a $10 credit, visit sanebox.com/MacVoices. Welcome back to Mac Voices. This is the Talk of the Mac community, and I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, we have yet another Take Control author on the line this time. Kirk McElhearn has updated his Take Control of iTunes to a new version to, well, we'll talk about what all's new in the book, because that's what we do here. Kirk, it's great to see you. Thanks for being here.
Hey, Chuck, it's good to be back. We haven't talked in quite a while. And I think the last time we talked, I was in a different country, wasn't I?
I believe so. In fact, I might have been in a different part of my country, too, I think. I don't know. We got to make this a more regular thing. That's all there is to it.
Okay.
But I want to make sure, before we get into the new Take Control book, I don't want to forget that I had to go to Macworld to find out that you are part of, I guess, a new podcast, or you're new to the podcast, and you're doing this on a little more regular basis.
Yeah. Well, you found out at Macworld, but not for me because I didn't go.
Right.
You saw one of my co-hosts, Ian Schrey. Ian Schrey and Rob Griffiths were doing a podcast called The Committed, and they'd been doing it for a few months. They had a third person, Tyler Pogue, who was their additional co-host, and he didn't want to do it anymore, so they asked me to join. It's been about 2 months, I think 6 or 8 episodes, and it's new to me to be a regular host on a podcast, as opposed to the occasional guest on podcasts like yours or the Macworld podcast. It's quite interesting. I'm not doing any of the technical stuff. I'm not doing the post-edit and all that, which is hard work. But it's interesting to plan things out and to come up with subjects and to figure out what we want to talk about, who we want to invite, because we're starting to plan to invite guests and all of that. No idea where it's going to go, but it's fun. You can find out about it at thecommitted.tv or at my website, McElhearn.com, and I'm sure you'll put that in the show notes.
Absolutely. So,
Right.
so I should ask, given that it's you, Ian, and Rob, does the Committed have any, second kind of meaning? Is this committed as in committed, or is this in committed as in restrained?
As in straitjacket.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's more committed.
Okay.
Committed to technology. I didn't come up with the name. I sort of dropped into it, but I'm pretty sure that's the logic. I should maybe ask, because if it's committed as in straitjacket, maybe I should change my allegiance here.
Well, I know Rob a little bit. I know Ian very well, and so you better ask the question.
Yeah.
Well, Kirk, the main reason we're here, I did want to make sure we got that in, but the main reason is that you'd have a new version of Take Control of iTunes from the Take Control ebook series. And I'm always anxious to talk to you about iTunes, because iTunes seems to get such a bad rap in so many ways, and yet it's still the centerpiece of Apple's media environment. And so what do we have new in iTunes that you felt it was worth an upgrade, or an update to the book, I should say, this time?
Well, the last update to the book was when iTunes 11 came out. So there's been several editions of this book, and the current one is Take Control of iTunes 11, the FAQ, because it's written in question-answer format. In the first version of the book, it was pretty much iTunes 11, but a couple of things got left behind because they were a bit complicated, and we'll get to that in a second. But in addition, Apple's made a number of changes since iTunes 11 was released. This is version 1.3 of the book. Version 1.1 was just a minor update to fix some typos. Version 2 added iTunes Radio, because that wasn't in iTunes 11 when it was first released. It only came out in iTunes 11.1. It added Genius Shuffle. It added stuff about Notification Center. And this new version adds a couple of new things and something that wasn't in the initial book. So the new things are the iTunes Store wish list, which you can access from the store or from your library. And, iTunes, while you and I probably use it to manage our music and podcasts and everything else, Apple's main reason for iTunes is to get people to buy stuff. And if you remember in the past, they tried that sort of iTunes social network called Ping, which was a way of trying to get store content into your iTunes library. And that died a quiet death. And now they're putting the wish list in the library, basically just so it's easier for you to get access to this stuff and to buy it when you want. Another thing that's new is not so much iTunes, but Mavericks. So if you're running OS 10 Mavericks, you'll have noticed you have an iBooks app, which you didn't have under Mountain Lion previously. And because of this, iTunes no longer manages ebooks. So you used to have a books library in iTunes that managed your ebooks and your audiobooks. Now, if you're in Mavericks, you have an audiobooks library, and your ebooks are in the iBooks app. That's really confusing. Audiobooks, ebooks, iBooks. Sounds like a good tongue twister. So there are a couple of changes to that, and one of the changes is that iTunes doesn't manage them. But the other change is that all through the book, I was talking about the books library and not the audiobooks library. So, a little change like that means we have to change something 50 places in the book sometimes. And so we get to the big missing feature of the first version of the book, and that's podcasts. And you and I were talking just before we started recording. When iTunes 11 came out, the podcast management it's a disaster. It's confusing. The first thing that happened is people who upgraded from iTunes 10 were losing their podcasts because iTunes wasn't copying them over. Managing these stations and the way things are in the cloud, it makes no sense at all. And to be honest, when the first version of the book came out, I didn't have time to figure this out. It was just too confusing, and I needed to really work with this for several months to figure out how to do it. So I've put an ample section into the book about podcasts, how to work with them, subscribe to them, manage them, sync them, and all that, and also how to view them, because one of the things that makes the podcast management more confusing is that the way you view them is different. As you know, when you view your music and your movies and your TV shows, you can view them in similar ways, not exactly the same, but with podcasts, it's totally different with podcast stations and all sorts of weird things. So I've added a very big section about that, and that's probably the largest update in this version of the book.
So I want to circle back to the ebooks, iBooks. What was the other?
Audiobooks.
Yeah, the three, to make sure that we get that straight. So iBooks right now is out in its own separate application.
If you have Mavericks.
If you have Mavericks, yeah, I'm sorry.
Right.
If you have Mavericks.
If you have Mountain Lion or earlier, then you've still got your books in iTunes. And this, of course, is another thing that's complicated when you're writing a book about an app that sort of forks, that one version of the OS does one thing and the other does it differently.
Right. And, I mean, frankly, I think it's a good idea to start breaking off some of these pieces into separate dedicated apps so that you're not trying to fight to force them into this interface.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about that. Maybe we'll get into that later.
Okay. But so iBooks are over there. Audiobooks are in iTunes, remain in iTunes, which makes a certain amount of sense since they are audio. And ebooks are over with your iBooks?
Well, ebooks are... So there are two types of ebooks that you can have. They could be PDFs or they could be EPUBs. If you buy ebooks from Apple, they're EPUB files, and they're in the iBooks app. If you buy PDFs from anyone else, you put them in the iBooks app as well. Now, there's a slight difference. If you buy an album that comes with what's called a digital booklet, so it's liner notes in a PDF format, that stays in your music library. Now, before, as you know, I'm a big classical music fan, and a lot of people I know who are classical music people would put their PDFs into their books library to be able to access them differently from their music. And now you can't do that in iTunes. So you've got to put them in the music library, which basically means you're taking a PDF file and you're telling iTunes that it's a music file. And iTunes says, hey, that's fine. But it makes it a little more confusing to manage. Now you can have PDFs of, say, take control of iTunes. You can get it in a PDF and you can put that into iBooks. But if you get digital booklets, they stay in iTunes. And so splitting iTunes apart can be interesting in some ways, but it can be confusing as well, as you can see here. Obviously, you get used to it, but it's a little bit, it's odd to have the same kinds of files in two different places.
Right. Now, as someone who tends to like to break the rules just because I want to, can I take those digital books that you're mentioning and force them into iBooks if I want?
Only if they're PDFs. If they're EPUBs, iTunes won't accept them.
Okay. And can I take PDFs and put them either place if I want to? If I want a PDF, even though it's not a liner notes book, into iTunes, I can force it in over there.
You can, but you have to change the format. Well, you select the file when you've added it to iTunes. You press Command I, you click on Options, and for media kind, you put Music, because there is no book media kind anymore in iTunes. And if you want to do that, you could create your own genre, say PDFs or books. When you're looking at that info window, and you type a genre in the bottom of the window, you're not limited to the genres that Apple gives you or that iTunes uses. You can type any genre you want. You can type, hey, this genre is Chuck Joyner. And if that's what you want, that'll be the genre.
Okay.
So if you want to put a bunch of PDFs into iTunes, you can put them all under the genre PDFs, books, or whatever, but they have to be considered to be music files.
Okay. And I don't really, sitting here, I'm not quite sure why I'd want to do that. It's just that whenever a program starts to force me in one direction or another, I'd like to know that I have the option should I find that it doesn't work for me. But it sounds like there is a certain logic to what's going on here. It's just maybe takes a little while to understand.
There's a logic, but I've been in touch with people who used to use iTunes to manage large numbers of PDFs. Because of the way you can tag them, you could make smart playlists and you could look them up and you could put keywords in the comments or something. Let's say you're running a company and you've got documentation for your machines and you've got 10,000 files. It can be useful to manage them in iTunes, even though iTunes is made for music. iTunes is just a database. And managing other files works the same. And I know people who've done that. I think if you wanted to manage these files in any other way, I'm not really sure what kind of app could do it in a similar way to allow that sort of multi-criteria search that you could get in a smart playlist, to be honest.
Okay.
I think of something like Bare Bones Yojimbo, which lets you store things with keywords and all that. But I'm not sure it's quite as flexible.
Okay.
There are some people who do it. It's not the mainstream, obviously.
Yeah, and that's a good use case, but it's a very specific use case.
It is, yeah.
Okay. All right. So now we got the whole ebooks, iBooks, audiobooks thing straightened out. Now let's move over to podcast.
Podcast.
And I'm going to say right up front, when iTunes 11 came out, that was sort of the breaking point for me because I just became really frustrated. As you said, I lost podcasts. I couldn't get podcasts to sync properly across devices. And so, much to my surprise, I abandoned iTunes. Is it time for me to think about coming back, Kirk?
Well, I've adopted a solution. So you've seen about all these channels and everything you create, podcast stations. A podcast station's sort of like a smart playlist. And you have a list of podcasts and you download them from the cloud and all. And I spent months trying to sync and make sure that things were up to date. And I realized that all you have to do is just go back to the way it was before. Stop syncing your subscriptions. Just create a playlist with all your podcasts. Smart playlist, Kindest podcast. And maybe if they're checked or not, whatever, if you want to copy them all or you don't. And just sync them to your iOS device and just use it like that. Don't automatically sync anything from the cloud to your iOS device or to your Mac. Because that's when you've seen in the podcast app on your iPhone or whatever, that all of a sudden you see new episodes that show up in a podcast with a little cloud icon, but you don't want to see these because you've already listened to them. You can just get rid of all that. And I explained how to go back to what's pretty much the iTunes 10 solution in the book. The other option is to choose a different application. My app of choice is Instacast, which has both Mac and iOS versions. What about you?
It's funny you say that. I've been absolutely sold on Instacast. I'm evaluating Downcast right now. I just started yesterday, actually, to play with it because there are a couple interface quirks in Instacast that I don't find as useful as they could be. So and Downcast seems to have them, but I want to make sure Downcast performs as well as Instacast does.
I'm happy enough with Instacast that I really haven't spent any time with Downcast to look at it. I probably should. It would be useful, but people I know who've used it a lot say it's pretty similar. The concept is the same. The idea is the same. Both of these apps will sync, download, or not sync, depending on what you want. They're a lot better for managing The only thing is I kind of like to have all that stuff in iTunes because it means that all of my media content is in one place. It's easier to back up. I have a huge music collection. I have a bunch of these here, hard disks, naked hard disks, and I have a drive dock. So you stick the drive in and you copy to it and you pull it out. And I rotate these between my office and a safe in the garage, which is fireproof just in case. I don't want to have to plan 6 different folders to get all my media into these to back it up. One of the things about the iBooks app is your books are no longer easily accessible. They're in a folder hidden in your user's library folder, about 8 levels down, and I mentioned in the book how to get there. But before, if you were just backing up your iTunes media folder, all of that stuff would be backed up. For iBooks now, it's not the case. If you're using a different podcast app, it's not the case because they generally put stuff in your library folder as well. So I'm more comfortable with all of that being in one place. In fact, I have one hard drive connected to my Mac Mini, which is my desktop Mac, which is a 2 gigabyte hard drive. And the volume name is Music. It's got all my media content, music, movies, TV shows. I don't want to have to worry about things being in other places, but that's just me. You know, a lot of users, they don't care. They don't back up stuff anyway, do they?
Yeah, well, we're about to tread into Joe Kissel's territory of backups.
Yeah, so exactly.
We won't go.
You know,
go there
I'm a backup fanatic, and as I said, I've got a huge music collection. And it's not so much that this music is music that I bought and downloaded digitally. It's music that I've ripped from thousands of CDs. And when you see the time it takes to rip a CD, check the tags, add album art. I just got a new drive today, a Blu-ray, CD, DVD, Blu-ray drive, and it's very fast, and it rips CDs in about 3 minutes. But if I had the time to tag and get album art, you're about 6 or 7 minutes per disc. That's, you know, a few thousand CDs. If I lost all of this, the time it would take to re-rip all of that would just be impossible.
Yeah. And, you know, it's something that I think people forget about. They figure that they can, okay, I'll re-rip the CDs, but they forget all the little niceties, that the playlists they built, the star ratings, all the things that you've invested into your library, that if you lose that, you can recreate it, but you aren't going to be done until about 2016. And
well, again, it's, you know, there are a lot of users who just don't care that much. They've got a couple thousand songs in their iTunes library, and they listen to them at random or not, with playlists or not, and that's fine. And that's probably 80% of iTunes users. I'm one of the edge cases, and I'm in contact with a lot of other people who are edge cases. Most of them are people who are very interested in either classical music, jazz, or live music like the Grateful Dead. So people with really large music collections. And these people realize the time that they invest into this and the need to back up. And, you know, it's a huge process to get it right, to be able to find what you want when you want to very quickly. I just published 2 articles on Macworld. This week, I don't know what day this podcast is going live. 2 articles about tagging music files. In the first article, I say, well, what are tags and what are the important tags? And I walk people through that. Now, in the second article, what I did is I took 500 songs. I asked Doug Adams, who runs the Doug's Apple scripts for iTunes website, who makes all these wonderful scripts to make using iTunes so much easier. I asked him to write me a script to put random characters into the tags. So I have 500 songs with random characters for the name, for the artist, for the album, random years, random characters for genres, etc. And what I did is I ran this through a couple of programs that can fix the tags. And the 2 programs did pretty well. Out of 500, I think one of them missed 14 songs and one missed 23. Of course, they weren't all correct. But even after you do that, you've got a lot of work to get the tags the way you want. So it's just a huge task. It really is. And when you do it one album at a time, one disc at a time, you know, as I said, 6 or 7 minutes, it goes by quickly. But if you've got to do all of that at one time, and then, as you said, your playlists, and you've lost your ratings, and you've lost your last played dates and play counts and all that, it can be a disaster. So take control of, what is it? Take control of Mac OS, of OS 10 backups. I forgot the exact title.
Yeah, Joe's book.
Yeah. Because if you don't back up your iTunes library, We say in the computer industry, it's not a problem. It's not a question of if your hard drive's going to crash, it's when.
Yeah. And it's funny to talk to you. You're being a fanatic about backing up your iTunes library. We talked to Derek Story, and he's like, "Oh, you got to back up your photos." And
Photos, yeah.
then you talk to someone who is an author, and you got to back up your documents. And at the end of the day, you just do everything.
You just got to back stuff up.
Yeah. Just back it all up, and then you don't have to listen to any of us anymore. You can just skip over these parts.
Well, but then you won't buy our books that talk about backups. I mean, my book's not about backups. I do mention it in the book, saying how important it is. And in fact, I think it was in iTunes 10 that Apple took out a feature that they had that would help you back up your iTunes library. It was initially designed to back files up onto DVDs. And it was actually pretty nifty because it would remember the last time you backed up. So if you backed up a month ago and you went to run a backup today, it would only back up what was new or changed since then. It was really good. And they took it out. Well, basically, when they started all the cloud stuff, they took it out. And now iTunes users are pretty much on their own as far as backups are concerned.
Kirk, I want to go back to the idea of splitting off things from iTunes. And I say that because Apple seems to have already started maybe that process just this much by making a separate podcast app for iOS. Should they make a separate podcast app for the Mac and then let them be a little more like some of the third-party solutions you and I were talking about, Instacast, Downcast? Or is it better if they try to continue the path they're going where on the Mac they have it all in one place and in iOS it's a bit of a separate discipline?
Yeah, iTunes is one of those subjects that gets a lot of people, ruffles their feathers. And one thing you hear often is people saying iTunes is bloated. Now, to me, this is a pretty misguided statement because no app is bloated unless it's forcing you to use everything it has. And that's not the case. You look at Microsoft Word, you could say it's bloated because it's got a lot of features and they're hard to find, but that doesn't affect the way the app actually works in most cases. iTunes actually, I said earlier, iTunes is a database. It's a little more than that. It's a database, and it's sort of a wrapper for QuickTime to play back content. Now, in iOS, it's interesting that Apple did split things apart. So there's an iBooks app, there's a podcast app, there's a videos app, there's an iTunes U app, there's a music app. The iTunes Store is separate. The App Store is separate. So you've got, 6, 7 apps already. But if you're taking your content from your Mac, which you think of as your digital hub, and you're sending it out, it makes more sense that everything be together and not apart. Imagine that iTunes were split into, say, iTunes handles music, and iTunes Video handles video, and you've got iBooks already, and Podcast handles podcasts or whatever. You still have to have one app that brings these things together when you're syncing your content. So is it really any better to have 6 apps than to have one, and to perhaps force a user to open 3 or 4 of them when they want to change things before they want to sync something? With iTunes the way it is now, you can drag a folder of content into it. And this content can be music, it can be podcasts, it can be TV shows, movies, iTunes U, apps, and all that. And ringtones even, voice memos, and you can drag all of this into iTunes very simply. Now, if iTunes were split apart, what do? Does iTunes act as a traffic cop and shunt things off to different apps, and the user's trying to remember which app it's in? I don't think that's the best solution. I think iTunes, as a music management tool, is really quite powerful. As a database for finding your content, either with smart playlists or searching, is quite powerful. And as a syncing tool, it's quite powerful. But if you're going to split off the different bits, users are going to get confused. Do you remember how it was when we had to use iSync to sync things like, contacts and calendars?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Now, not only did iSync not work very well, but it was confusing. Why open another app? And, of course, they rolled that syncing into iTunes if you're not using iCloud, so you can sync your email accounts and your contacts and your calendars. I just don't think that having multiple apps on the Mac side is really useful. In fact, I'm almost surprised that they did come out with an iBooks app. The only real thing that the iBooks app offers that wouldn't have been easy in iTunes is the display, the sort of book-shaped display by default, page format display, which you wouldn't get from the iTunes window. And that might be the only reason they did that. But why would you roll out a movies app on the Mac or a TV shows app on the Mac? I just don't think it makes any sense. I think it would confuse too many people.
Okay, you've convinced me, because I hadn't really thought about the Videos app on iOS being a separate app, the App Store app being, a separate app. I guess I don't know why I didn't recognize that fact, but I didn't. And so, yeah, they make a little more sense on the iOS side. I guess I've been a victim of listening to too many people beat on iTunes and say, it's terrible, it's cluttered, it's non-functional. I don't know.
Well,
I mean, it is.
You can say it's cluttered because it does manage a lot of content, but it's not non-functional. Yeah, there are lots of problems with iTunes, like with any other app. But I write about iTunes a lot. I get a dozen questions from readers of my Ask the iTunes Guy column from Macworld every week, if not more. I have a huge music library, so I'm constantly working with iTunes. And sometimes you just have to think a little bit and figure out how to make things work. But I don't find things that don't work. It's very rare that I find something that really doesn't work that's really a problem. But iOS is a different animal. It's a one feature app animal, and it makes sense that the different apps be like that, because you may never want to put videos on your iPhone. So why have an iTunes app that has a videos tab on the iPhone? You've got a small screen. It doesn't make sense. I would actually like to see them split out the music app and make a separate app for iTunes Radio. To me, that almost makes sense, because sometimes you have to tap a lot of times to get to iTunes Radio on the music app. I would like to have that as an app on its own, where I can just tap and I'm there, and I tap a station and it goes on, instead of losing my place in music, maybe going to one of those little icons at the bottom. But if it's not at the bottom and you have to tap the little more icon, then you can have 6 or 8 taps before you get your station on.
Yeah. I think I understand why people feel that iTunes is cluttered and is difficult, but on the other hand, it does make a lot of sense to manage your media from, everything now except iBooks, from one location. And also the idea that iTunes started out as one thing, and it's grown and it's diversified. And there weren't podcasts when iTunes started, and videos were not included, and books of all the flavors were not included. So it's had
2001. It was music only in 2001. In fact, it was MP3 only. Podcasts were added in 2005, I think. Videos were added. I don't know. Along the way, it's added all these different types of content. Now, we can rest assured that there won't be any other types of content. Can you think of any other digital content that will exist in the future? If we have holographic sort of film equivalents, they'll still be called movies or TV shows. So we have reached the end of the line for new content. There's nothing missing. You might imagine them treating magazines as magazines instead of treating them as subscriptions inside the newsstand app, and maybe making a magazines app to read them on a Mac, which actually would be kind of nice. But I can't see any other content that they're going to add. They're not going to come up with Smell-O-Vision. So, we've reached the end of the line in terms of content. It's not going to get any more cluttered. If you, by cluttered, you mean the number of types of content. If anything, what's going to happen is, as time goes by, people's libraries are going to get bigger and bigger, and they're going to need to learn more about how to manage all the content they have. iTunes Match, for example, is still limited to 25,000 tracks. Now, when iTunes Match came out, my music library was about 120,000 tracks, and I've split it into 2, but there's no way I was going to reduce it to 25,000 tracks. So I do have an iTunes Match library on my laptop, which I use regularly for testing and writing about, but I don't use iTunes Match daily because I just can't. They won't let me put all my music in it. I keep getting more and more emails from people who are reaching that limit. So it's showing that over the years, if people were buying, a few hundred tracks a year, their library is not going to grow that much. But if people who really like music and buy a few thousand tracks, and not from Apple, because things you buy from Apple don't count against that limit, well, they're starting to hit the 20 and 25,000 track limit, and they're starting to come up with problems. So iTunes is mature, and users are getting more mature in the way that they use iTunes as they have more content.
This edition of MacVoices is brought to you by SaneBox, the best way to take control of your out-of-control email. For a free trial and $10 credit, visit sanebox.com/MacVoices. When I first heard about SaneBox, the name struck me as rather unusual. Then, when I learned it was an email prioritization service, it made perfect sense. Inbox, outbox, SaneBox. Especially since the flood of email was driving me insane. Before SaneBox, it was nothing for my inbox to gather up a couple hundred emails overnight. Press releases, newsletters, unsolicited information, promotional notices, receipts for online purchases, notifications, as well as those emails sent by real humans on a one-to-one basis. It was getting to the point I didn't want to go to sleep because of what would pile up. SaneBox to the rescue. When I turned SaneBox loose on my own inbox, it cut it in half, just like that. And I panicked, because suddenly I wasn't seeing all that stuff and was afraid I was starting to miss important information. And then I learned that, while some of it was indeed important, it wasn't urgent, so SaneBox sent it all to the Sane Later folder. And my panic subsided because I started to get it. Then I turned on the Sane Bulk folder, and all my receipts from Amazon and other retailers were moved there. And then I turned on Sane News, and all my newsletters and lists were all suddenly in one nice, neat folder. I didn't lose a thing, it was just organized in a way that it had never been organized before. So if I had a free few moments, I could catch up on my newsletter subscriptions. Or when doing the monthly accounting, I could actually find the receipts for what I had ordered by looking in the Sane Bulk folder. See, that's the beauty of SaneBox. Everything goes somewhere. You know where it goes and can find it and never even have to tag it. And if an email isn't going where you want it to, you can simply train SaneBox to treat it differently and designate it as something else. By focusing you on only the important emails, you save time and effort and can get to that other stuff later. Or not at all, secure in the knowledge that SaneBox has put it somewhere and that you can find it if and when you really need to. It can be a challenge to explain just how powerful and useful SaneBox is. That's why you need to try SaneBox for yourself for 14 days completely free and find out how it will work for you. Visit sanebox.com/MacVoices to get that free trial and to get a $10 credit on any SaneBox plan when you decide to sign up. And I predict that you will sign up because you can get very used to that focused inbox very quickly. That's sanebox.com/MacVoices for your 14-day free trial and $10 credit on any SaneBox plan. A productivity tool I really don't want to do without. SaneBox, the best way to take control of your out-of-control email. Thanks to SaneBox for sponsoring this edition of MacVoices. Kirk, is that a place that Apple's falling down? The iTunes Match with 25,000.
Yeah,
and
that's
the recognition that we all are gathering up more stuff and putting in our libraries. Now, I don't know about you. I do not archive podcasts. I listen to them. They're pretty much one-off. And I don't have a problem. If there's something I want to keep for whatever reason, I'll go and dig out the file and move it someplace separate and safe. But they're really, those, with the exception of a couple instructional podcasts, those are kind of few and far between. But that said, that's about the only information in my library that expires or, gets discarded. Other than that, everything that goes in doesn't come out.
Yeah. One of the only podcasts I keep is the Garrison Keillor Lake Wobegon podcast, because they're just so wonderful. I want to be able to listen to them again in the future. In fact, 20 years ago, I was buying cassette tapes that were sold of some of his shows because I loved them so much. But it's true that podcasts you don't keep. The thing is, we're on the cusp of a very large change here between having media on your computer or in your home and getting it all from the cloud. We're seeing iTunes Radio as a form of streaming. It's not on-demand streaming of exactly what you want. You can download previous purchases from the cloud. You can stream movies, TV shows you bought from Apple. And we're going to have more of this in the future, but we're not there yet. And I don't think we're going to be entirely there for quite some time because, well, people who are our age, we have large libraries of physical content, CDs in particular. B, not everyone has fast internet. Before the show, I was explaining to you my internet here. I have a 2 megabit DSL line, but I also have satellite internet. Now, the DSL is fine for everyday use, web browsing and email, but it's not enough to download HD movies. So I use the satellite for that, but I've got a limit of 50 gigabytes per month, which means that, you get an HD movie from the iTunes store, it's about 4 gigabytes. So if you're going to be streaming a few TV series, you get some season passes, or you want to use Netflix or something, it eats up to 50 gigabytes very quickly. Now, I'm the only person in my area who has satellite. All the other neighbors have DSL at 2 megabits. Most of them don't even understand about streaming video yet. So this is all going to happen, but until everyone gets the bandwidth necessary, we're going to be using physical media, and this is going to take, 10 years, 20 years? How long will it take for everyone to get fiber, unless they come up with some new discovery that makes, DSL go 10 times as fast, which I doubt.
And of course, I've had this discussion on the show so many times. I'm still just this much wary of depending on the cloud to get that kind of media, simply because I don't know when the caps are going to kick in. I don't know when someone's going to say, okay, you can get your email and you can get your podcast, but if you start wanting to stream a movie every other night, okay, then you're going to have to pay us a whole lot more. And, as opposed to going to, in the U.S., going to a Redbox or going somewhere to rent a physical object. Is it as convenient? Absolutely no. But on the other hand, if it starts making a $50 to $100 a month difference in my cable bill or my connectivity bill, then it's suddenly going to turn around and become very, very popular.
Yeah, and the other thing is, how long is this content going to be available? The sort of Disney strategy of releasing a movie on DVD and then taking it off the market for 5 years to make people sort of want it again when they re-release it. What I've seen several times is movies that are available on iTunes that aren't anymore. Now, technically, you're supposed to be able to re-download your previous purchases, but I don't trust that 100%. There is some music that I bought from the iTunes store that's no longer available, and one of my tracks was corrupted, and I couldn't re-download it because it's no longer available. Now, in this case, it was a live classical concert. There might have been a rights issue, but hey, I bought this at a certain time, and now I can't get it back. There's going to be a time when some of this content's not available. There's going to be a time, I think it's less likely with Apple, but when companies go out of business and content that you bought and that's stored on their servers is no longer yours. We saw this with Zune, the very short-lived Microsoft Zune player and music service that had DRM, and when Microsoft turned off the DRM servers, you couldn't access the music anymore. Now, there weren't a whole lot of people who bought it from Zune, but still. I've got CDs that I've had since, the late 1980s. I started buying CDs around 1986, so this early in the CD period. And these CDs will still work in 20 or 30 years unless I scratch them or damage them or something. So I'm always a little bit sort of skeptical about the future of non-physical media. On the other hand, I very rarely buy movies in any format. I'll buy a movie on Blu-ray if I really want to keep it. Otherwise, I'll just rent it. I think I've only bought 2 movies from the iTunes store, and mostly for testing. I don't believe in paying their prices. And, of course, sometimes it's cheaper. They had a mistake a couple months ago. They had all the Harry Potter movies for $10 in HD. And it was in the morning here in Europe when all of a sudden people on Twitter were talking about it. And by the time it was morning over in the U.S., they had fixed the price. It was a mistake. So I bought all the Harry Potter movies. It's a tough one. Because I hadn't seen them all. But I really have very few movies that I bought. I just don't believe in buying movies like that at the prices they charge. how many movies do you watch more than once anyway?
Not many. I mean, there are some. There are
Yeah,
some. And but this gets to a whole discussion, and we could probably go for another 2 hours on owning versus
it's renting.
renting movies, and the idea that how long is long enough to rent a movie.
Yeah,
Is it? Do I should I be expected to sit down and watch it in one sitting? Should I be expected to sit down and watch it in 48 hours?
yeah,
And can I watch it multiple times in that 48 hours, or is it a one play thing? There's so many variations on the way people use all these forms of media. And I
yeah,
think what you were saying about music, yeah, you buy a CD, you and I are used to, we now own this piece of music. It is ours, and they can't change, they can change all the licenses they want, but they have to come and physically beat down my door to get the CD from me. That's a different thing when you're streaming it from the cloud, because tomorrow it can be revoked and that's it. Or worse, depending on which service you got it from, or which service you're using, it could disappear from that service and it's gone.
Well, and here's something that a lot of people don't realize, and it depends on how fanatical you are about music. Um, let's take the Beatles as an example. So the Beatles, when they released their early albums, they were in mono and then they were in stereo. And when they were released on CD, the early CD masterings were very bad, and then there were some remasterings in the '90s that were better, and then there were another series of remasterings that were better, and then there's been another series of remasterings. Now, if you use iTunes Match to match your Beatles songs, or if you buy Beatles songs now, you're going to get the latest remasterings you may not want. You may want a previous one. It may match your song, but not give you the exact same song. I did a test a while ago. Apple has this thing called Mastered for iTunes. And what it basically means is that instead of converting a CD quality file to an iTunes store file, they convert a higher resolution file to an iTunes store file, with the logic that the higher the resolution, the better conversion. This is debatable. And I did some digging a couple months ago, and I found that in many cases, not only are the mixes bad and the mastering bad, but there's clipping. Now, clipping, as you understand, maybe some of the listeners don't, is when the audio is too loud, and that when you see on a waveform, it goes to the top of the waveform, and it basically gets cut off because it's too loud. And a lot of music is done with what's called audio compression that makes it all louder, and you don't hear the quiet parts and the loud parts. And some of these Mastered for iTunes tracks have clipping. Now, if I match my Wish You Were Here album, I want to hear it the way my CD is, and then I get the Mastered for iTunes, and it's not the same. It's a different mastering with different loudness applied to it. So you may not actually get the same tracks that you've bought if you buy them digitally today. In a year or two, there may be a different version that's given to you and not the same one.
And boy, I mean that's a challenge, and also the incomplete catalog situation, where if you go, especially to the streaming music services, and I'm not going to even speak to iTunes, but I can think of a number of albums that I've went and specifically looked for on different streaming services that weren't there, even though they claimed to have the full artist catalog. And so, I'm sitting here with a physical CD saying, this is not there, so therefore it is not the full catalog. I understand different record labels, different rights, different distributions, and all that, but still, we still have this issue. And I'm really shocked that the music industry has not figured out a way to grant licenses globally. And I don't even know what exactly that means, but I guess so that they can improve the viability of these services and therefore the consumption of music, as opposed to this constant splintering that seems to go on. And they really think that, I'm sorry, but I think that they believe we're going to fall for it and pay them a whole lot more money. And I would rather buy the physical media, take those few minutes to rip it, and then I know it's mine. I know it goes into storage, so it will always be mine, and I'll have it the way I want it.
Yeah. A couple of points you raised are very interesting. I think a month or two ago, I looked on Spotify at what they have from Miles Davis. And they have a lot of Miles Davis albums, but there are a lot that they don't have. But what surprised me is that some of the albums have tracks that are unavailable, which basically means that, you see 4 or 5 tracks of an album in black type and a couple in gray, which means you can't play the others. So the rights holders have licensed most of an album, but not the whole thing. because they don't want you to hear the whole thing on Spotify, or probably it's the same with the other services as well. One of the big problems with streaming music, and with music in general, is that this is a very balkanized licensing system. It's split into territories. So a given artist has their record label release their album, and they license it to certain people in their home country. So let's say the United States. And the territory there is probably North America. So United States, Canada, maybe Mexico. A different company licenses this to release it in South America, a different one in Europe, a different one in Asia. And within Europe, there may be different splits as well. There could be often France, Belgium, Luxembourg being French-speaking countries, and Switzerland are considered to be a territory, and other countries are other territories. So you've got these groups that are distributing and licensing and selling music, and they don't want to lose their share of the pie. The record labels don't want to get these groups angry because they've been working with them for a long time, and these people have built up distribution deals. And a lot of them may be distributing both physical and digital. So we're in a period where I kind of think the record industry would like it to be easier, but for now they just can't get it that way. I know a number of people who run classical music labels, and I look at the way distribution works, and obviously it's different than the major labels for pop music. But they may have a different distributor in each country. So if they license something to a streaming service that's covering all those countries, they've got problems with a distributor who doesn't want to sell their music anymore because it's available through a streaming service and they don't get any money, yet they've been promoting that record label in their country. So there is some logic to the fact that it doesn't work, but someone has to fix it.
And who's that going to be? Yeah.
Well, Apple's done a good job of, I wouldn't say forcing, I would say coercing record labels to do certain things in a certain uniform way. But Apple can only go so far. You know, if Apple comes out with a streaming service, a real streaming service, where you choose what you want and you stream it, which I think they're going to be doing soon, this will certainly have a great influence on streaming music and licensing around the world, because Amazon is the 1,200-pound gorilla in the business. Sorry, Apple is the 1,200-pound gorilla. Amazon is number 2. And curiously, Amazon doesn't have a great deal of influence. They sell a lot of CDs. They don't sell as much digitally, and they don't have a streaming service yet, but they may. So all of this is in such flux. And just to end by sort of a little jab at the record labels, you know, CDs came out, they charged exorbitant prices. Everyone replaced their LP collection, and the CDs maybe weren't mastered that well, so you had to buy another better mastered edition. And record companies had sort of income that went up in the CD era, and then sort of everyone, once they had replaced their collections, that income went down. It just so happens that that drop in income coincides with the rise of the internet. A lot of piracy has affected the music industry, but a lot of price pressures have brought prices down on music. They're not living the champagne and caviar lifestyle they used to. They'd love to go back to that, to the days when they were printing money with CDs, and that's not going to happen. So they do have a bit of bitterness that they've lost all this income that they had by, a lot of people say, gouging consumers.
Oh, I'd like to go there, but I'm not going to. You know, it just, you look at some of this stuff and they wonder why people pirate music. They wonder why people share music the way it's not supposed to be shared. And it doesn't seem to be a whole big mystery to me. I don't know. It just, people want what they want, when they want it, how they want it, and they're willing to pay for it at a certain price. You go beyond that, or you make it difficult for them, and they're going to get it anyway. They just do it by alternative methods.
Well, it's interesting. You know, one of the biggest areas of piracy these days is actually TV series. And as an aside, I think we're living in a golden age of television. And we have been for the past decade. And we've got some great series out there. And these series are appreciated around the world these days. The real popular ones are things like Game of Thrones and Mad Men. 24 is coming back next week. And people will grab these things illegally very easily. So what's happening over here, when I think it's season 4 currently of Game of Thrones started, it was on in the UK at the same time as it was in the States. So it was on at 3 in the morning, the first episode. In other words, people who had, and it was on Sky here, which is a subscription service. So if you had Sky, kind of like HBO or whatever, you could either stay up and watch it, or you could record it on your DVR instead of going to the Pirate Bay, because otherwise it would be on here a week later. Now, they're doing the same thing for 24 in France. Someone told me they're doing it in France. So it's on Tuesday night, and so it's going to be 3 in the morning or 4 in the morning, whatever, in France Wednesday, in order to make sure that people get it and don't pirate it. Because what was happening some years ago is that these series wouldn't get to European countries other than the UK because of the language. They wouldn't get to European countries for months. If a series came on in the spring in the States, it might not be on in France or Spain or Germany until the fall. But people wanted to see it, so they would just pirate it. So now what's happening is that the TV studios and the networks, they're realizing that they've got to change what they do to meet the demand of the public. And I think that's a good thing. I think the music industry is going to have to think it's not the same problem for music as it is for TV, because you've got the time sensitivity of TV series. But I think the music industry is going to have to sort of sit back and think, what do our listeners really want? And let's try and serve them instead of just serving our own interests.
Kirk, we've gone way beyond take control of iTunes, the fact, but it's always a great discussion. To circle back, I'm going to ask you to give us the specifics on that. It's obviously available at takecontrolbooks.com. How much is it, and what's the upgrade policy for this versus, I guess, the prior version?
Yeah, if you have the prior version, I'm pretty sure you get a 50% discount. To be honest, I'm not sure, because I really don't pay attention to that, but you do get a substantial discount. It's $15 is the cover price. I'm just looking, it's 236 pages, this edition. It's about 30 pages of new material, but also the layout's a little bit different. But it's 60 some odd thousand words, so it's getting to be a pretty big book. And actually, if you already have a copy of the book, please pay attention to the email you're going to get about upgrading, because we've set up a survey to ask you some questions about the book. And we'd appreciate if any existing readers could answer this survey so we know what you're interested in for future editions.
Great. Thank you very much. And thanks for a new version of the book, especially addressing the podcast issue, because it's obviously something near and dear to my heart, near and dear to yours as someone that's now producing a podcast on a regular basis. And it's still it's a great new, it's not quite a new medium, but it's as close as we've gotten for a while, for people to go and get very specialized content. So if you're not paying attention to podcast folks as much as I'd like you to, please go and check it out. I mean, it's interesting. Kirk and I are sitting here. He was talking about a podcast he saves. I'm thinking of the ones that I would save that are completely different. So there's all kind of great stuff out there. It really is.
There are tens of thousands of great podcasts. Some of them are radio shows. There's one that I listen to, a radio show from WNYC in New York, a guy named Leonard Lopate, who interviews really interesting people. And some of them are what we're doing. Some of them are just people sitting around and talking. Some of them are full cast things with a dozen people. It's a wonderful medium. It really is. I'm surprised that it still remains somewhat confidential, in the sense that, we know a lot of people who know what podcasts are, but a lot of people don't.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's one of the challenges we all have about the podcast medium, is to spread the word about it, that you can get very interesting, very specialized content, whether it's woodworking or music or politics or whatever, that you can really do a deep dive into your favorite subject or subjects through some of these podcasts that are just such high quality.
Yeah, and kudos to Apple, because when Apple added podcasts to iTunes, that's what really changed things and put them mainstream. And I don't think there's a single podcast in the iTunes store that's not free.
I think there may be no. You're right. I think they have access. Some have subscription models.
Some have subscription models, and you have to enter the URL separately, manually, into iTunes. But I don't think there are any that are sold in the iTunes store. And there are tens of thousands of podcasts in the iTunes store free. Some of them have ads, obviously, which makes sense because you've got to get paid for your work.
Right.
But they're free. You don't have to pay for them. You've got tons of content, be it news or, as you say, music, interviews with people. I love listening to interviews with authors and musicians, and there are just gazillions of podcasts out there.
Kirk, I also want to make sure that I give you a chance to plug your blog, because I know that's another place where you're delivering a lot of great content, that especially when it relates to iTunes, but also in a lot of other things.
Yeah, my blog is called Kirkville. It's McElhearn.com, McElhearn.com. I actually just reserved Kirkville.net, and I'm not sure if I'm going to move that over. It's just redirecting for now, but it'll be easier for people to remember. I write about iTunes, I write about Macs, I write about classical music. I write a lot about the theater. I live a few miles from Stratford-upon-Avon, and I'm a Shakespeare buff, so I've been reviewing productions of the Royal Shakespeare Company lately. I write about books and tech subjects and all sorts of interesting things.
Great. So there's just a lot of places people can go and find your work. Yeah.
Well, on Macworld, for one, where I write regularly, including the Ask the iTunes Guy column, Take Control Books, my blog, your podcast, the Committed podcast, that's the committed.tv. Just Google my name. I'm fortunate to have one of those names. It's very uncommon. There aren't many McElhearns in the world, so you Google my name and you'll find lots of stuff.
Kirk, it's always a pleasure. We have to do it more often. No question about it.
Thanks for having me again, Chuck.
Folks, again, Take Control of iTunes, the new version by Kirk. Get it and get updated on everything that's new in iTunes. Until the next time, this is MacVoices. I'm Chuck Joyner. Thanks for watching. Visit MacVoices.com for links, show notes, to subscribe, to connect with Chuck on Twitter, app.net, Google+, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Subscribe to our weekly newsletter, the MacVoices Dispatch, to stay up to date with all the latest MacVoices news from our front page or at macvoices.com/newsletter. Advertising and sponsorships handled by Backbeat Media at backbeatmedia.com.